Kaprilik katothemon imeid stilikas eritosken thepanoktelin, insok nekāchtas eriptaniisse tanoston ankomean meidstak kīthrālin. Thene ontilan itropan, Afiches ithracentāsa chi katmonin anchi meidsti meiran ipson, kīthrālitani impa methrapson, kelatstrin nola kratstrin I meidsta ikirem. Kitses thene iodstiske Nekāchti ibiloha, nos animalin ilaranaske itrikelos. Or at least that's what a Nekāchti speaker might tell you. In actuality, Nekāchti is just a conlang I started working on in 2016. And, at the time of recording, it's my most thoroughly developed and possibly my favourite language that I have yet created. Nekāchti belongs to the Nethārenok language family, one of the largest and most diverse language families in the world. Nekāchti has undergone many tumultuous changes over the 6,000 years since the proto-language was last spoken. Foremost among them is in the phonetic inventory, which is simplified considerably. Within the main branches of the Nethārenok language family tree, the sound series of Proto-Nethāren merged in various ways. Specifically, in the branch leading to Nekāchti, in due order, the uvulars merged with the velars, front-rounded vowels lost their rounding, the prenasalized stops became plain voiced stops, aspirated stops became fricatives, and finally, voiced stops ended up being lost in various ways, leaving Nekāchti with a rather modest collection of only 13 consonants and 4 vowels. Concurrent with all these sound changes, the basic CVC syllable structure of Proto-Nethāren increased in overall complexity in Nekāchti, but with a lot more restrictions on how syllables can be put together. No word may begin or end with more than one consonant. A word may begin with any consonant, but the only consonants permitted to end a word are M, N, S, and K. A word internal cluster may consist of a maximum of a nasal or obstruent, followed by an obstruent, followed by R. There are no diphthongs and no geminates. In addition to these constraints, however, Nekāchti's long and turbulent history has resulted in a host of phonological quirks that only apply sometimes. Sometimes K disappears between vowels, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes T turns into an R, and sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes sounds just appear or disappear seemingly at random when words are conjugated, and, frustratingly for new learners, the only way of dealing with these is through brute force memorization. Default stress is on the antepenult, with stress falling on the penult only if it contains a long vowel or is closed. Nekāchti uses its own script, which I'm honestly not really sure how to classify in terms of system. The closest real-world equivalent would probably be Hangul, or maybe Sinhalese, I guess? It's a system I like to call a super alpha-syllabary, and once again, the best way to grasp what that means is with a history lesson. The Nekāchti people were first introduced to the concept of writing when they encountered the Aedun script, one of the oldest writing systems in the world, which became very popular in the central regions in the years before the First Empire of the Sun. Thing is though, learning to read and write with the Aedun script is, well, to put it lightly, staggeringly difficult. Explaining the complexity is well beyond the scope of this video, I'll save that for another time, but here's the basic gist of it. Let's say you wanted to write the word khan, or to sell. One way to do this is to use a determinative like sunga, gold, to hint that the word has something to do with money. Then you can follow it up with a character for a word that begins with the same consonant-vowel sequence, like kambu, armorfish, or one that ends with the same vowel-consonant sequence, like tan, or sun. Or, if you're feeling particularly generous, you might even include both. In which case, since khan is a one-syllable word, the syllable characters will have an overlapping vowel, and using this method, you can even write out every single syllable of a polysyllabic word, giving you a pretty airtight way of conveying the exact word you're trying to transcribe. The only problem is that, by the time the old Nekāchti speakers were introduced to this system, the syllable characters and determinatives had been created and standardized over 1,000 years prior. And in that time, the Aedun languages had gone through a number of substantial changes, none of which had been documented in the writing system, giving Aedun one of the worst spelling systems in history. So while this word used to be pronounced exactly how it's spelt, tangrkim, after 1,000 years of history it's pronounced dzvirjan, but the spelling is still exactly the same. Needless to say, the Nekāchti weren't particularly impressed. It was already bad enough that they had to map the characters for Eidun's foreign sounds onto their own phonology, and that they needed to memorize hundreds of syllable characters on top of thousands of logographs, but throw in these terrible spelling rules on top of that, and you might as well just call it a day. But the Nekāchti didn't want to pass up on an invention as useful as writing, so the Royal Council of Scribes convened to try and find an easier way to write. After countless hours of scrutiny, they started to notice a pattern amid the madness. Often, definitely not always, but often, when written in the expanded form, the top character will hint at the first sound of the syllable, while the bottom character usually indicates the sound that ends the syllable. The vowel, on the other hand, is basically impossible to predict. By this point in history, the Eidun vowels had shifted around so much that you might as well just make a blind guess, because those syllable characters certainly aren't going to help you out. So, said the Nekāchti scribes, we'll just ignore the vowel. Let's just take the glyphs for the R syllables, which most often keep their quality, and if the vowel is something other than R, we'll mark that in with a diacritic. Using this system, the number of necessary characters was reduced from multiple thousands to only 36. The simplicity of this system made it spread like wildfire across the subcontinent, and, after a few centuries of handwriting, once the initial and final characters blended together into ligatures, the Nekāchti super alphasyllabary was born. In this system, entire syllables, including onset, nucleus, and coda, are encoded in a single character. There are also 3 special characters that represent a voiceless stop followed by R, a particularly common sequence in Old Nekāchti. The script also uses a basic system of punctuation, and, while Eidun was pretty flexible in terms of writing direction, Nekāchti is now written exclusively right to left. The Nekāchti are very proud of their writing system and frequently impose reforms, though there are always a few lingering instances of historical spelling. Unfortunately, however, Nekāchti's grammar is not so straightforward. Nekāchti is highly synthetic, more than a little irregular, and has features such as split ergativity, non-configurationality, and double marking. Nekāchti takes animacy very seriously. All nouns are classed as either animate or inanimate, and are treated very differently depending on how they're classified. Typically, only animate nouns take plural marking or the definite article, while most inanimate nouns are treated as mass nouns and are ambiguous to number. However, to emphasize exactly one of something, a singulative marker exists, which also has a number of unique derivational properties. The animacy of a noun also interacts with case marking. While some older Thracian languages had over a dozen cases, Nekāchti retains only 7. The core arguments of a verb phrase are most often marked with one of 3 cases. The nominative marks both animate subjects and inanimate direct objects, the accusative marks animate direct objects, and the ergative marks inanimate subjects of transitive verbs. However, Nekāchti also features a high degree of quirky subject, so the subject and object can be marked with other cases depending on the properties of the verb. For instance, the benefactive marks the subject of a verb of experience, the instrumental is used for the agent of an accidental or involuntary action, and the locative and genitive mark the objects of a change of state. The subject and direct object are also marked on the verb with an obligatory set of prefixes, including separate markers for the animate and inanimate third person, and a distinction between proximate and obviate arguments. Marking an argument as obviate indicates that it's less salient or relevant to the conversation, or that it's already been introduced to the discourse and is therefore background information. The indefinite marker expresses that the argument is unknown or undefined, and is often used to derive intransitive verbs from transitive ones. There's an ergative split in these prefixes as well, with first, second, and animate third person following an accusative pattern, while the obviate and inanimate third person and the indefinite person follow an ergative pattern. That is, the subject prefixes of an intransitive verb serve as the object prefixes on a transitive verb. Note that since a third-person animate subject and a third-person inanimate object are both encoded by the absence of a prefix, and that the nominative is marked by a lack of a case suffix, then in a sentence with an animate subject and inanimate object, like for example, Ankali toko kirok, the king looked at the tree, neither of the nouns nor the verb will take any role marking at all. The sentence is still understandable because, more often than not, the subject of any given transitive verb is going to be animate, while the object will be inanimate. So in this case, we can assume that the king is the subject, since trees aren't particularly well known for looking at things. If, however, it is in fact the tree that is the subject, then the marking changes to become tokos ankaleri inkirok, with all that extra marking reinforcing that this bizarre and counterintuitive notion is indeed the meaning that's being communicated. Verbs are also marked for tense by combining a stem alternation system with a series of suffixes. Back in Proto-Thracian, a bare verb was interpreted in the simple or perfective aspect, and reduplicating the first syllable resulted in an iterative or imperfective reading. Modern Nekāchti retains this system, having a long and short stem for every verb. However, while in the old days the form of the long stem was perfectly predictable, so many sound changes have happened since then that now some of the long and short stems are virtually unrecognizable from each other. For example, the short stem of the verb to create is nios, and so you would think the long stem would be nenios, but actually it's nerios. Why? Well, in Proto-Thracian, the verb was completely regular, formed with the short stem ndeu, with a prenasalized stop, and the long stem was therefore ndendeu. As the language evolved, however, e became I when next to another vowel, and u became o in all environments, which obfuscated the original reduplication pattern slightly. Then later, prenasalized stops became pure nasals word initially, and plain voiced stops word internally. And finally, much later, d became r between vowels. This same series of changes affected other words that began with prenasalized stops, but words that began with a pure nasal in the proto-language follow a much more transparent pattern, and in the modern language there's no way of telling which pattern a given word will follow. The long and short verb stems combine with a number of obligatory suffixes, rather innocuously termed as the tense suffixes, though they encode a lot more than just tense. Over millennia, various auxiliary verbs evolved and became suffixed, which encoded different meanings depending on whether they were paired with a long or short stem. As more and more auxiliary verbs became suffixed, Old Nekāchti became heavily agglutinative, but later on, sound changes blurred the boundaries between affixes, melding them into a single, highly fusional suffix. There's a whole lot of information packed into these things, so we'll take it one step at a time. Each of Nekāchti's 12 tenses is formed by combining either the long or the short stem with a tense suffix. The present, perfect, imperfect, and future all function as you might expect, and the nomic marks states of being or general truths. The perfect, imperfect, and nomic each have an indirect version as well, which serve to indicate inferential or second-hand evidence. The habitual marks actions that occur often or customarily, while the past habitual can best be translated with used to. The experiential marks actions that took place at an indefinite point in the past and can also be used as a sort of remote past. Finally, the conditional can be used for hypotheticals or just as a general irrealis. Each of these tense suffixes also has a negative and interrogative form. Proto-Thracian and many of its descendants have a negative and interrogative auxiliary, but in Nekāchti they became affixed to the verb and have now fused with the tense suffixes. Similarly, what began as modal auxiliaries became suffixed to form 4 grammatical moods: the indicative for general or factual statements, the optative for actions that are desired or intended, the potential for events that might or are able to occur, and the necessative for events that must or need to happen. Finally, there are 5 different conjugations based on the phonology of the stem, producing 560 distinct combinations of tense, aspect, and mood. Thankfully, you don't have to deal with the full spectrum of verbal madness too often, as Nekāchti permits a maximum of 1 fully finite verb per sentence. To link clauses together, Nekāchti renders verbs in subordinate clauses as converbs, which convey meanings that in English are usually expressed using conjunctions. Notice how only the main verb takes person marking. Unless otherwise specified, converbs are assumed to have the same subject as the verb in the main clause. Nekāchti uses these converbs extensively in clause chaining, but also for derivation as well. Like the expression for to weave, nios ipsi, literally means to create by means of intertwining. Nekāchti also makes heavy use of compounding and noun incorporation for derivation. Over the eons, some frequently incorporated elements have become fossilized as dedicated derivational affixes, but one of Nekāchti's unique tricks is deriving new words using case suffixes. For example, one could say something like tokos tseriok itevik, the tree caught fire, where tseriok consists of tseri, fire, with a locative case suffix. While here this word functionally serves as an adpositional phrase, it can also be used as an adjective, as in tseriok toko, the burning tree, or more literally, the on-fire tree. This can then be turned into a noun by applying the singulative to create tserioka, something that's on fire. And this can then be appended with further case marking, as in tseli tseriokan, the light of the burning thing. Or it can even undergo noun incorporation, as in sitseriokanalak, I extinguished the burning thing. Literally, I on fire thing extinguished. This system is extremely flexible and is used pervasively to derive new nouns and adjectives. Adjectives fall into one of two broad classes, noun-like and verb-like. The majority of adjectives are verb-like, having been derived in Proto-Thracian from stative verbs. These adjectives are able to take much of the same morphology as verbs and can stand on their own as a predicate. Meanwhile, noun-like adjectives take entirely different morphology and require a copula when used predicatively. Similarly, there are two classes of postpositions, one older class derived from Proto-Thracian verb roots, many of which shortened up to become case suffixes, while a newer class of postpositions has since evolved from nouns that works in combination with the case system, with the exact meaning depending on which case the noun is placed in. Nekāchti is radically non-configurational, with word order being shuffled around to convey focus and topic. Focus is sentence initial, and the topic, as well as any obviate argument or other background information, usually comes immediately before the verb, which is most often the last word in the sentence. And that is Nekāchti in a nutshell. As always, there's lots of additional details I don't have time to get into here, but I hope this has served as an adequate overview. If you want to see more content like this, let me know in the comments below or consider supporting me on Patreon. Until next time, Pechaspimo Kiron.